Hello everybody, and welcome to my talk, which is entitled Adapting Science Fiction to Comics, Storytelling, Style and Genre, or to give it its alternative title, The Art of Unfaithful Adaptation. So the thing I want to talk today about is the process of adapting the novel Odd John and the play RUR into comics. And I really want to explore the various choices that shapes my approach to adapting this. I was the writer, and also the choices that were made by me and my collaborators, the artists that worked together on this work, in really kind of our approach to telling these particular tales. So yeah, to give just a little bit of context, as Caroline already mentioned, I'm a professor of comic studies in the new School of Humanities, Social Sciences and Law, and also director of the Scottish Centre for Comic Studies. I have research interested in numerous areas. I've done research on British superhero comics and also adaptations of literature to comics, with a particular interest in science fiction adaptations into comics. I've done some work on Frankenstein, War of the Worlds, and so on. For several years, my research has had a creative practice element to it, working with artists to produce comics that relate to my work, so a kind of creative investigation of the things I'm also writing articles and books about. So one of the great things about that, obviously, is getting to work and to meet and work with lots of talented artists. Many of them who've taken the Masters in Comics and Graphic Novels, so I bid for funds for them to work with me on these comics. So Odd John and RUR, here are the novels and the play. Odd John is a 1935 novel by Olaf Stapledon. It is really about this race of super beings, or referred to as supernormals in the book, who are humanities' evolutionary competitors. Capex play 1920 RUR, which gives us the word robot in English, the first use of the word robot in English, is about the creation of synthetic beings, and over many years they gain a degree of independence and eventually revolt and eradicate all mankind. So the robots appear for the first time in this play, or the use of that word, and then they promptly annihilate all humanity. I'd give a spoiler warning, but it hasn't been around for a bit. So these are the two things I want to approach. Both stories have links to my research on superheroes, science fiction, and especially Frankenstein. In many ways, both these texts are kind of influenced by the themes of Mary Shelley's novel. As I say, I want to look at some of the choices me and the collaborators made while producing those. To give a little bit of insight into the thinking about the approach to adaptation and this idea of unfaithful adaptation. You know, one could argue that all adaptations are in some way, shape or another, unfaithful, whatever that might mean. But one of the questions that people often ask about adaptations, or one of the things they often say, is they talk about its faithfulness, its fidelity to the original. It's one of the most kind of common complaints, that an adaptation isn't faithful in some way to the original, whatever that means. The adaptations that I've taken on start with the proposition, don't want to be faithful to the original. But, I actually want to query that notion of the value of faithfulness to the original, because in many ways an adaptation isn't an attempt to recreate something, particularly when you're transposing it into another medium. You're not trying to recreate an original text. That can be impossible in lots of different ways. But what you're really looking to do is create a dialogue with that original. And in some ways, adaptation is a kind of form of critique. You're picking up themes within that original and taking them in different directions in a way that creates a dialogue with the original text. So that's kind of where I come from in this process of adaptation. One of the quotations that I always kind of go back to with this is from André Bazin, who was a film critic. And he wrote an article called Adaptation, or the Cinema as Digest, in 1948. What he meant by cinema as digest is he meant that whenever you're adapting, he was talking about novels, you adapting films, that whenever you do that, you have to condense in order to adapt something to novels. So it's a kind of digest version of the original. But his quotation there in this article from 1948 is he says, "Faithfulness to a form, literary or otherwise, is illusionary. What matters is the equivalence in the meaning of the forms." So finding an equivalent thing in the medium that you're adapting into that is the equivalent of something that's happening in the original source text. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, how I found equivalences and points of contact with the original, which isn't just an attempt to recreate the original in a different medium, but to do something a bit different. So that's kind of my mantra as somebody who's involved in adaptation. All adaptation, as I say, necessarily unfaithful in some way, shape, or another. So Odd John was this novel that I approached. This is with artist Helen Robinson. It's the first ever comics adaptation of Stapledon's story, and it's actually been acknowledged by the Stapledon estate as authorised comics adaptation of this novel. So my adaptation suggests, and the one that I'm collaborating with Helen Robinson as the artist, suggests that the connections between the novel, several connections between the novel and superhero comics, which relates back to the themes of some of my research, but also explores the themes of ethics and eugenics that emerge from the novel. So that's some of the process sketches and examples of the final artwork. One of the things I really want to capture in this, and I think that Helen really brought out in the artwork, is that there's moments in the novel where the narrator and the readers are invited to introspect on the strangeness of the superhuman and the strangeness of Odd John and the supernormals. And so structuring the story, there was lots of places where there's no words, or the pacing slows down, or there's double page spreads to kind of create that sense of introspection. One of the most important parts of the story, or aspects of the story, is it's quite oblique in certain ways. There's certain things that Stapledon suggests, but doesn't really go into detail about. And there's an overall kind of impending sense of doom throughout the novel. It's all leading towards something. And that's one of the aspects of equivalence that Anne refers to that I really want to capture with bringing Helen into this, because I think her style suggests some of the mood of and the style of Stapledon's writing, and that's transmuted into the visual aspect of the style. That was a real challenge because there's a kind of movement between a kind of solidity in the storytelling, and also a kind of obliqueness, a kind of slipperiness in the storytelling, things that Stapledon suggests that often slip away from the reader, or you have to think about it. So I think Helen's artwork really captures some of this. She also did a great job of kind of capturing the detached impishness of the oddness of the table character, Odd John, particularly when that kind of impishness sharply descends into brutal murder and violence. The novel's very kind of deliberately uneven in that sense. The sense that it's not really possible for us human beings and the narrator who's telling the story to really understand the motivations of this super being who's so unlike us and so inhuman in lots of ways. So this is also one of the places where I brought in a kind of deliberate infidelity to the text, because I create a direct link between my prior research. I've done a lot of work on Superman comics being reprinted in Britain and the influence that has on British superheroes, and the narrator actually makes a decision to tell the story because he comes across the reprint of the Superman story in Triumph Comics, and that's obviously not in the novel. That's a kind of way in which I've connected it back to my own research, and you've got to make it your own in some ways. And so that's kind of key. There's extensive use of visual metaphor in the comic as well, to represent, as I've mentioned, what the novel only alludes to. And a deliberate kind of mix of styles. I like the way that Helen was able to kind of capture a kind of sweeping, romantic kind of painting style, but also with kind of elements of manga in some of the character design. Odd John is described in the novel as having, like all the supernormals, abnormally large eyes. So we can invent that and use the kind of manga aesthetic. We can see manga and anime with large eyes. The image of John in space this is not something you'll find in the novel. This is me drawing connections between Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons and the character Dr. Manhattan in that story, who's a kind of evolved super being who doesn't really perceive time and space in the same way as other human beings. The novel ends very ambiguously, and I think the end of the novel is a bit of a trap. I think Stapledon immediately believes a certain thing has happened, but actually there's evidence all the way through the novel that something other than what has been suggested has actually happened. And in my adaptation, I wanted to use, not just to replicate Stapledon's ambiguity, but actually to take a line on it, to take a view, to offer an interpretation of what might have happened, which isn't the only one, but it's the one that I think is quite interesting. So there's misdirection that Stapledon gets involved in, and rather than kind of following that misdirection, I kind of direct it towards a kind of intertextuality in relationship with other texts that perhaps gives a sense of where the story is going. RUR is a story, as I say, about a robot uprising. Karl Čapek writes this play, and very successful play in the 20s and 30s, and popularised, as I mentioned, the modern use of the word robot. And there's some stills from some pictures rather from a production of the play. The usage of the term robot, the Czech word for robota, meaning forced labour or forced labourer, means was suggested to Čapek by his brother, who was an artist, Joseph. And the play was very critically acclaimed as a masterpiece of dystopian science fiction, but never really been adapted. Very influential in other stories, but never directly been adapted. Here's the comic that I produced with Nick Johnson. And I mentioned in Odd John that I kind of deviate from the comic, and we do that in this comic by altering the timeline, but also the origin of the weird protoplasm that the scientist Rawson discovers and then turns into these synthetic beings. There's a kind of suggestion here that he's not noticing that there's a meteor shower. He discovers this protoplasm, so suggesting that perhaps the origin of the protoplasm is in some ways extraterrestrials. It's referencing the film version of the 50s, it's referencing War of the Worlds, drawing a connection to other science fiction that I've been interested in working on. One of the key images of the play is this image of the dead world populated by robots are now devoid of purpose, and they're slowly winding down after they've killed all of humanity. So this is one of the images you don't really see in the play. It's talked about, it's suggested, you don't see it. And one of the starting points from my adaptation, both in Odd John and in this, is to visualise, in my telling the story, the in-between bits, the bits that you don't see that are alluded to, and to take those bits and run with them. There's also a kind of reference in the comic version that alludes back to earlier work that I'd done on Frankenstein, so it draws an even closer connection between RUR and Frankenstein.
3 minutes.
Great, cheers. So that's that kind of. I also do the same thing with Odd John, having in this world the robots can become the superheroes in a way. So linking back to my previous work on superheroes, and messing about with the timeline. I was able to, because I pushed the timeline of the play, we take it into more or less to the modern day, and so we reference lots of films, movies, other comics, anime, things like that reference robot apocalypses or so on. So we wind those into the story. So all the kind of things that have been influenced by the play RUR come into our adaptation in one way, shape, or another. There's references to the Terminator. There's also references to Planet of the Apes and various other apocalyptic stories that are hidden within the visuals. So there's lots of little Easter eggs in there. So for all the opportunities and the themes and influences that the play brought about, it's also a quite difficult play to adapt, because some of the themes I don't think didn't necessarily translate to a modern audience. So I think some of the satirical strategies are also perhaps a little bit off-putting. There's a whole kind of marriage plot which is very contrived, and the character Helena in the play doesn't really work for modern audiences perhaps. So we kind of changed that quite radically and altered various bits of the play to correspond to that. So we made our Helena more like a kind of Lois Lane figure, kind of tough, independent women. We kind of looked at some characters like actors like Basil Rathbone who performed in the play and made some of the characters reference points for quite famous actors for one reason or another. We played up the kind of dramatic theatrical aspects and made references to Akira in the conclusion of the play, and played up some of the key points about kind of existential threat of capitalism and commerce and slavery and so on. Also lots of references in our version of the ending. Our ending is very, very different from the play, but also it draws in lots of reference points from the Wonder in the Sea of Fog to Steven Spielberg's AI, also to the ending of Ghost in the Shell, famous manga and anime. And there's lots of connections and intertextual references all the way through these stories. And that was really the kind of key thing that we wanted to achieve in this adaptation. Also the kind of references to constructivism as an art style. Nick was very much using that as a reference point. You can see it very clearly in the cover all the way through it. One of the great things about it was we were able to have lots of Easter eggs. So there's kind of references to Joseph Capek's artwork in the play. But here's some process stuff that we did, that Nick did, and the kind of robot apocalypse, and also the factory there. I think one of the key things about this was that it's a very odd play. If anybody's read RUR, it's a very strange, tonally odd play. Very violent in some ways, serious in other ways, quite comic and a bit daft in some places. And so I think that the thing that was good about Nick's style is it has a slight kind of cartoony style. It's also constructivist, and when the violence comes in, it's quite shocking because it's done in this cartoony style. So the kind of thematic strangeness, oddness, and tonal variation that you got in the play, we translated that into the visual style. It was one of the reasons I thought Nick would be good for this, because he can capture that tension. And that's coming back to that equivalence between the meanings of styles. That's how we did that. We took the themes and the style of the writing in the play and transmuted that into a visual style. And hopefully the same overall effect is gestured towards. But, you know, I know my time's up, so that's the final version of that. Some fantastic artwork from Nick and Ellen on these comments. I don't know, do we do questions?
No, we won't.
Okay, then.
Will you be around in the break?
Yes,
we've got questions. So, Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So what I want to do today is take a very selective look at the history of Duncan of Jordanson College of Art and Design and highlight a few of the students and staff whose work has contributed to storytelling in some way, whether on film, television, books, comics and more. So the narrative-based art form that we first see the Art College getting involved in is the theatre. Students would occasionally put on their own plays, and at Easter time 1914, the Dundee School of Art, as it was then called, staged a play written by the local artist, poet and journalist Joseph Lee about the 15th century painter Fra Lippo Lippi. The art school staff were all actively involved in designing the scenery, costumes and props, and Lee starred in the play alongside various students. In the 1920s, students began staging regular cabarets and other stage shows, mostly as fundraisers for local charities such as the Royal Infirmary. But the students' main opportunity for dressing up came with the annual Revels, a huge fancy-dressed Christmas party which began in the early 1910s but became increasingly ambitious in the 1930s. In 1937, drawing and painting student Patrick Hennessy, who would go on to have a highly successful career as a painter in Ireland, staged a wonderfully stylised Egyptian ballet as part of that year's Revels. Such enterprises were actively encouraged by the head of drawing and painting, John Milne Purvis. A keen theatre-goer, he was one of the founders of the Dundee Playgoers Circle, and he and his daughter Mamie, who graduated from the Art College in 1938, regularly helped with scenic painting for Dundee Dramatic Society. Mamie was also a talented actress who appeared in several Dundee Rep productions alongside future film star Richard Todd, but stage design became her profession, and during the Second World War she was invited to London to design sets for Alistair Sim. In 1944, John Milne Purvis gave a lecture to the playgoers on stage setting and decoration, and another one 2 years later to Dundee Art Society on design in the theatre. In 1947, he designed a striking series of murals for Dundee Rep Theatre, featuring scenes from Shakespeare. The original designs for these are now held by Perth Museum and Art Gallery. I'll just run through a few of these. This is King Lear, Romeo and Juliet, Twelfth Night, and The Tempest. By that time, it was not uncommon for graduates of the Art College to go into theatre design as a profession. One particularly successful example was Betty Gow, who graduated with a design diploma in 1943. Her career as a scenic designer started at Dundee Rep, then continued at theatres in Colchester, Oxford, Preston, Liverpool and others. As theatre grew in popularity in Dundee, so too did the comics and magazines produced here by D.C. Thomson. The college often turned to Thomson's for part-time tutors in illustration. William Oscar Bevan taught the subject in the early 1930s. Perhaps his greatest claim to fame was that he sometimes modelled for photo illustrations as Thomson's legendary detective Dixon Hawke. Bevan's son Jeff also worked as an artist for Thompson's and became well known for his commando covers. One of Bevan's students was Sam Thayer, who would go on to a lengthy career in DC Thompson's comics. He was one of the original artists working on the Dandy when it launched in 1937, and is perhaps best known for his wartime propaganda strip, Addie and Hermie the Nasty Nazis. In 1934, the college replaced Bevan with none other than renowned comics artist Dudley D. Watkins, who would go on to draw Ur Wally, The Bruins, Desperate Dan, Lord Snooty and many others. Watkins taught illustration here until 1938, when presumably the demands of all these new comic strips left him little spare time. Later DC Thompson's comics artists to study at the Art College include Bob McGrath, best known for The Three Bears, Jimmy Glenn, who took over Lord Snooty from Watkins, and Jim Petrie, who drew 2,000 weekly Minnie the Mink strips between 1961 and 2001. But for many years, comics were clearly looked down on as a lesser art, and even in the late 1980s, when Colin McNeil came to study illustration, his tutors were less than pleased with his desire to spend all his time drawing comics. He quickly found success, however, and actually won his first professional commission while he was only in his first term at the college. His early work included creating covers for the final years of DC Thompson's science fiction anthology Starblazer, including the very last issue in 1991. By that time, he was already well established with a title that had transformed the landscape of British comics, 2000 AD, published by IPC in London. He began working for them in 1987 and had his first Judge Dredd work published 2 years later. He's since gone on to illustrate numerous stories for Dredd and other 2000 AD characters, as well as working for big American companies, including DC and Marvel. More recently, of course, the Art College has embraced comics as a legitimate art form. Comics modules were initially introduced to the undergraduate animation course, and several graduates from the course have become professional comics artists rather than animators, including Helen Robinson, who Chris mentioned earlier as the artist of Odd John, and Claire Rowe, who worked for DC on Batgirl, among others. It's also worth mentioning that the current editor of the Beano, John Anderson, is one of our animation alumni. Since 2016, the Art College has run a Masters of Design course in comics and graphic novels, expanding on the existing M-Lit course introduced by Chris in the School of Humanities in 2011. Again, many of its alumni have had professional success, a particularly notable example being Anna Morozova, now a regular 2000 AD artist. Away from comics, many Art College alumni and staff have found success in book illustration. Now, I'm not going to say much about this just now because we'll be hearing from Lindsay about her own experience in this area after the break, and we're going to end today by reading a few beautiful examples of students' illustrated books. But I just want to mention one other particularly notable example. Those of you of a certain vintage will no doubt recall the fighting fantasy adventure game books, which I'm happy to confess were a major part of my ill-spent youth. So I was delighted to discover that one of the most prolific illustrators of those, Russ Nicholson, was one of our alumni. It wasn't until the 1960s that the college started turning its attention to television as a potential source of employment for its graduates. The influential photography tutor, Joseph Mackenzie, had encouraged the head of graphic design, John Greensmith, to do film projects with his students. Some short animated films made as potential TV title sequences in the late 1960s still survive today. Greensmith subsequently made a research visit to the BBC's animation studios in 1971, though nothing seems to have come of this. By that time, some former students had already gone on to find success in television, notably Graham McCallum, who co-created the popular cartoon series Crystal Tips and Alistair in 1971, and also made graphics for Jackanory, Bergerac, Blackadder and many other series. And Don Taylor, who started work as a production designer for numerous series including Z-Cars, Top of the Pops, A Ghost Story for Christmas, Blake 7 and Play for Today. Then later, films such as Brassed Off, Little Voice and The House of Mirth. In the late 70s, they were joined by sculpture graduate Morag MacLean, who worked in the BBC's visual effects department, creating props and models for Doctor Who, French and Saunders, Lenny Henry and many others. She too has moved on to film, and her most recent credits include The BFG and Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. One of the most important contributors to the cultural life of the Art College in the 1970s and 80s was the writer and art historian Timothy Neate. Originally employed to teach in the General Studies department, he later relocated to the School of Drawing and Painting, where he transformed its teaching of art history and theory. In 1979, he initiated a highly successful Writer-in-Residence programme with funding from the Scottish Arts Council. Starting with Gerald Mangan, the initiative continued with Liz Lochhead, John Byrne, Tom McGrath, Douglas Dunn, Valerie Gillies and Harvey Holton. Neate was also a filmmaker, making several acclaimed documentaries including Hallaig on Sorley MacLean and The Tree of Liberty on Robert Burns. In 1988 he left the college to focus on completing his first feature film, Play Me Something, a collaboration with the art critic John Berger, released in 1989. Starring Berger with Tilda Swinton, the film was a fascinating meditation on the nature of stories and storytelling. In 1983, the college established a new honorary fellowship scheme and made film director John Schlesinger its first recipient. The principal of the time, Meyer Lakem, recognised the growing use of video technology and established a media studies department to run classes in video and electronic image making. That same year, 1983, the college achieved a major breakthrough, becoming the first institution in Scotland to get a Quantel digital paint box. Arguably the most advanced television graphics system in the world at that time, the paint box had only just started to be used by professional broadcasters like the BBC. According to Steve Partridge, who arrived in 1984 to run the new department, they weren't the Rolls-Royce of video, they were the Ferrari. An important early collaboration was with the college's writer-in-residence Tom McGrath, who had been the founder of the Third Eye Centre in Glasgow, which in 1976 had hosted Scotland's first exhibition of video art. Partridge and McGrath worked together on a series of video works called Two Reelers, shown in Edinburgh, Glasgow and London in 1985. Students soon started to make use of the new facilities. The 1986 degree show was the first to include video work alongside drawing and painting and sculpture. The following year, Sandra Christie became the first student to specialise in the new medium. Sculpture students were the ones who most enthusiastically embraced the new technology, a notable early example being Aaron Garbett, now art director at the computer games company Rockstar North. In 1986, the college introduced a pioneering new postgraduate course in electronic imaging, the only one of its kind in the UK. It attracted a wide range of students eager to get their hands on the college's state-of-the-art technology. Some of its alumni would go on to build successful careers in video and multimedia art, including John Thompson and Alison Craighead, Beverly Hood, Gordon Dawson and Pernille Spence. Others went into mainstream film and TV, and two have become award-winning feature film directors. Clio Barnard has won numerous awards as the director of The Selfish Giant, Dark River, Ali and Eva and others. David Mackenzie has directed many successful films, including Young Adam, Hal and Foe and Outlaw King. His 2016 film Hell or High Water received an Oscar nomination for Best Picture. Animation and computer graphics were particularly popular areas for the course, with new software programs such as Pluto and Symbolics allowing students to create entirely computer-generated imagery. Within a few years, the burgeoning visual effects industry had become the most popular career destination for graduates from the course. In 1992, the department won the Television Society's Thompson Award for its quantity of work of consistent high quality. That same year, it was renamed the School of Television and Imaging and received government funding for a complete overhaul of its facilities, which are now second to none in Europe. In 1994, the school introduced two new undergraduate degree programmes, Time-Based Art and Animation and Electronic Media. The latter has proved to be enduringly popular, and its graduates quickly found success in the animation and visual effects industry. There are far too many to mention here, but just to give you a few examples, and the images that you'll see here are from their student work. Hunter Park, whose recent animation credits include work on Doctor Strange and The Mandalorian. Julia Pegway, who worked for Aardman on Wallace and Gromit, Shaun the Sheep and others. Brendan Bodie, who later returned to teach on the course, having previously worked on Harry Potter, The Hobbit and The Dark Knight. Andrew Tulloch, who worked on Wonder Woman in 1917. Christopher MacDonald, who worked on Dunkirk and Game of Thrones. Gabriela Pruscauna, who now has the wonderful job title of Senior Creature Technical Director at Industrial Light and Magic. Meg Park, character designer for Disney and the main development artist on their recent feature Encanto. Michael Wilborn, visual effects artist on Avengers Infinity War and Star Wars The Last Jedi, and many, many more. And I should add that it's not just animation graduates that end up working in animation. Lauren Curran did an MSc in forensic art, but her skill at model making ended up taking her into the film industry, perhaps most notably designing and creating several of the puppets for Wes Anderson's Isle of Dogs. Now, all of these various people that I've talked about here have focused their talents on the more visual aspects of storytelling, but I want to end today by mentioning one former art student who has instead found exceptional success as a writer, and that's David Kane. Kane studied painting and photography at the college in the late 70s and began writing plays while unemployed in the early 80s. Two of his early plays, Lean Years and State of Confusion, were performed at Bonar Hall. By the time his farce, Dumbstruck, was staged at the Tron in Glasgow in 1994, he was being hailed as the Joe Orton for the 90s. By that time, he'd already achieved success on TV, notably with the Dundee set drama Jute City in 1991. Over the past 20 years, Kane has focused mainly on TV thrillers. As well as writing episodes of Taggart, Rebus and Foyle's War, he also created and wrote the Scottish paranormal drama Sea of Souls, and most recently has been the lead writer and executive producer of Shetland. So, all of you who are recently on the edge of your seats wondering whether or not Tosh was going to escape that exploding caravan, he's the man responsible. Now, there are many other alumni that I could talk about here, but hopefully you've gained a sense of some of the many different ways that artists, designers and writers coming out of our amazing art college have contributed to all kinds of storytelling, from stage to page and from TV to cinema. And that's all I've got time for, so I'll end there. Thank you very much.
I'm not a creator or an artist at all. I'm an A&E doctor, and we looked at teaching for student nursing for long. I've done a lot of teaching last year with some of the first graduates. I've brought with me Zana Al-Khatib, who's one of our current fourth year students at University as well. And the reasons for that will become apparent. So, when it comes to stories in medicine and stories that people hear about doctors practicing, these are the kind of stories that you often hear. You know, the idea of a NHS in crisis, whether that's an NHS in crisis from COVID, where there's a lot of stories from the centre about healthcare workers and doctors suffering alongside the wave after wave pandemic, and then also the stories that are now hitting us of our kind of NHS in infrastructural and systemic crisis that we can't cope with, you know, the patients that we have, and that's for a variety of kind of bureaucratic and political reasons. These are the stories that you commonly hear, but actually, if you speak to any doctor, yes, they'll talk about both of these things, but the main stories that they'll tell will be stories that they tell about themselves and their colleagues. It's not necessarily about the work itself. And that brings us on to the kind of written form of those stories that we tell. It's not a new thing at all. Hippocrates, in many ways, and there's probably clever people in the room who can tell me about his aphorisms, but these were really just stories that he was telling at the time, and that none of this is evidence-based. And a lot of them read like stories. The first aphorism of the life is short and the art is long, you know, that there's something very poetic about that. The more severe the disease, the more severe the remedy required. Again, very kind of poetic in its construct. And then into the 1970s, we had people trying to bring some more of the poetry and plot and fiction back into doctors' stories. So in this country, The Houseman's Tale was very popular in the 1970s and was then made into a BBC series. US, and particularly among older generation clinicians in this country, The House of God by Samuel Shem became a seminal work that everybody wanted as a kind of, this is the reality of my story put into somebody's other fictional words. And then people are trying to develop that idea as things have progressed into the kind of modern age of medicine. In the 21st century, we've seen Atul Gawande talk about kind of system processes and how that makes him feel as a clinician, and tell his own story about the death of his father. Paul Kalanithi, I don't know if anybody has read this in the audience, but an excellent book called When Breath Becomes Air, which is a really touching story of a doctor's last days in dying of lung cancer. And War Doctor, a really powerful book by David Knott about his experience working as a humanitarian war surgeon in many war-torn parts of the world. These books are really powerful stories, but they're also not without their own flaws. Atul Gawande are sometimes criticised for kind of systematizing narrative in a way that suits him best. Paul Kalanithi, a lot of people would argue this poor man worked himself to death and for the sake of a story, not for the sake of his family or for his patients. And David Knott, while he's done some incredible work, sometimes is criticised for having a little bit of an ego trip. This is a guy who wants to be the surgeon at the cutting edge, at the finest line. And this is probably the one that you will all be familiar with the most, Adam Kay's story of This Is Going to Hurt, which was recently made into a BBC series. This is what got me involved with storytelling in medical school, is that I was asked to give a session on medical memoir in relation to Adam Kay's This Is Going to Hurt to the student selected component students who were doing a SSC in art and medicine. And we talked about how Adam Kay's narrative, whilst a very compelling narrative, it's not without its own flaws. And certainly when the TV series came out, there was a very, very big backlash from the medical community about how this is not how we treat patients, this is not how we treat human beings, this is an example of a bad doctor, not a good doctor. This is a narrative done for his own self-interest and not for his patients or for the rest of the medical community. But I suppose that's easy for me to say. It's really easy for me to criticise and point fingers and pick holes in other people's narratives when you don't really know my narrative. So when I was Dana's age, this is where I was. I was on the west coast of the United States, driving north towards Oregon with my American girlfriend, who then became my wife somehow, somewhere down the line. Having just failed my final year of medical school, not really sure if I wanted to be a doctor anymore, found the whole experience pretty harrowing, pretty rough. I felt that medicine took a lot more out of me than it gave back to me. And it wasn't until somebody had recommended me exploring the narratives, exploring the memoirs of other doctors, and talking to people about their experience in a bit more detail, that actually I was brought back into the fold a little bit to realise another way of practicing medicine is possible, another way to be a good doctor is possible. And I've now been practicing for 7 years. I'm an ST4 in emergency medicine. I'll complete my training in about 3 years' time. And I love my job. I'm really glad that I'm still here. This is Dana's background, though, sorry, Dana will now tell you a little bit about her background and what brought her here.
Hi everyone, I'm Dana. I'm one of the 40 medical students. I'm Palestinian, but I was raised in Jordan, which is just across the river from Palestine, and we border with the West Bank. This is a photo of Amman, and that's the capital city. This is downtown Amman specifically. And the one thing I want to point out about this picture is that this is where most people live. These are the conditions that most people live in. So in a nutshell, it's a very resource poor area. It's a war zone, that kind of thing. And if I could give one statistic to try and paint that picture, the UN defines water scarcity as anything beneath 500 meters cubed per person per year. And in Jordan, there's only enough water available for 100 meters cubed per person. That was kind of the environment that I grew up in. But the only difference is, and the only reason that I'm the one standing here in front of you all today, is because I have a massive unfair advantage compared to everybody else in that I can afford to pay for an education abroad, to try and pursue a different life. And that was essentially the reason why I decided to pursue medicine in the first place. Initially, I wanted to pursue show jumping professionally, and I decided to hang up my spurs because I was curious about medicine, but mostly because I felt like I owed it to my community and to my people. And that was my initial motivation. I came in almost with a sort of naively painted picture of medicine, thinking that it was going to be very humanistic in the way that it was practiced. But there was a very big difference between that image and the reality of the way that medicine is taught and practiced in the first world, that resulted in me going through a very sort of difficult and challenging period of culture shock. The first 3 years of medicine for me were a bewildering array of facts that were just thrown at me through a computer screen, and I was expected to remember them. But within a few weeks, I would learn something, and within a few weeks, I would just completely forget it. Aside from all of that, I had portfolio assignments, I had a CV to do, specialty training to think about, and I just kind of lost sight of who I was and what my place was. And the worst bit of it all was that I would look around and I'd think, well, everybody else seems to be fine fitting in, so how come it's just me? I thought I was struggling alone, and I was genuinely convinced that I was going crazy, that there was something wrong with me, first being somewhat of a misfit. My biggest mistake was that my response to all of that was no response. I did absolutely nothing about it. I kind of shoved it to the back of my mind, like, fine, I'll just get on with my work. Until towards the end of my 3rd year, I finally broke under all of that pressure, and I decided that I was disillusioned and desperate enough to seek help. Knew at the time was my portfolio supervisor, and he was the only person I knew because of COVID. I never really got the chance to network or try and rebuild my life. So he was the only person I knew, even who was practically a stranger. But I reached out to him and I said, look, I don't know what I'm doing here, I'm really struggling. And he offered me 4 stories, the first of which was his own. And it's something I've since heard that story more than once. But it remains a very, very consoling tale when I think about, especially on the days when my imposter syndrome gets bad and I think, oh, do I belong here? What am I doing here? And I think actually it's not so bad. I could fail my final exams and I'll be great in a couple of years, I'll be fine. The other 3 books he gave me, I borrowed them from him, and I could spend hours talking about every book separately. But in summary, they were each different tales of people who went through medical school and who documented their stories in their memoirs and their fictional tales, and were a reminder that actually I'm not crazy and I'm not alone, and it does get better. So the most important thing that they did for me was that they kept me up at night to read them, to really reflect and try and connect between the insights that were in the books and between my own experiences. So I ended up with actually being in a position where not much has changed about my life. I still have imposter syndrome. The NHS has not changed. I still have so much work to do, and I'm still stressed about my finals. But at the very least, I know it's not my fault. There's nothing wrong with me for it, and I'm very slowly trying to find my footing and find my place.
I think this leads me back to much larger questions in medicine, but also kind of larger questions in, I think, a lot of our work, whether that be some incredible comics or children's stories or, work with Wellcome Trust and art exhibition is, we're all trying to do this for a great sense of person who's in connection, that excellent to turn out to be a Venn diagram where we can all learn, feel, and think through art. I think good medical memoir and good medical stories kind of give us that. But importantly for me as an educator, they try and educate me towards what a good doctor looks like, but also what a good doctor can be. And that doctorhood, for want of better words, and I apologise for kind of shoehorning that phrase in, does sit alongside, not integral with personhood. We, as medical educators, are trying to craft doctors out of teenagers, which is a really rough thing for them to go through. It's a really rough thing for me to put them through. And I have to reconcile that with my own story, with other stories, but also their stories, and where they come from. And that allows me to reflect, but it also allows them to reflect. Reflection is a really big, sexy thing in education generally now. And it's something that we are currently assessed on quite heavily in medicine, and how much we reflect, the quality of our reflection. But what I think that medical memoir and medical fiction can give us is a quality of good reflection that's honest and authentic and not just performative. And then leading on to how do we train all this, how do we teach all this. I don't really know. So I think this is probably one of my favourite hikes up in Western Ross area. I don't know if anybody knows that, Michelle, a train station up there. It's brilliant. You get off the train and you are in the middle of nowhere, right? But it's very intimidating when you first get off the train and the train driver leaves you behind because you are lost. Right? And that, in so many ways, is what it looks like to stop and look around you in medicine. Because you feel like you have just gotten off the train and you are lost and everybody else is carrying on.
Oh, sorry.
What's your name?
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously. There is context to this. You have to yeah, you can feel very lost. But I think ultimately these stories that we are telling ourselves, telling each other, are really important for giving us that guide, giving us that way to find ourselves and find where we ought to be. Profession at times, in a really intimidating and overwhelming profession at times, I feel like it's really important for us and ultimately for culture and society and our place within it. Thank you.
Okay, so Matthew's all just reminded you that this is the centenary of Joyce's groundbreaking novel. And this hefty tome is more often bought than read all the way through. I think many of us are kind of guilty of that, as it were. I'm lucky it's my job. It squats reproachfully on countless shelves, postponed to our next lockdown, or an imagined marooning on desert island discs. Even Joyce's life partner, Laura Barnacle, famously never read it. She was once asked how much of it she read. She said that the title page and the first one. Nonetheless, despite intimidating bulk and modernist experimentalism, Ulysses remains one of the most creative and influential books ever written, continuing to inspire writers, artists, film and TV program makers, from Angela Carter to Mel Brooks to The Simpsons. At its core is everyday life, and a celebration of anonymous individuals battling forces threatening to undermine our common humanity and our ability to empathise with one another. It was mostly written during the horrors of the First World War, but it was published a few years after its conclusion. Its modern Odysseus, the Jewish Irishman Leo Blue, protests against the imperialism and mass murder of the age when he says, force, hatred, history, all that's not right for men and women. The seeds of Ulysses grew from a real experience when an ordinary Dubliner, a man called Alfred Hunter, who was rumoured to be Jewish, acted as a good Samaritan towards the young Joyce himself after a drunken fracas with English soldiers in 1906. An incident which also plays a pivotal role in the novel itself. So Joyce retold Homer's Greek epic, the Odyssey. Ulysses, of course, is the Roman name for its hero Odysseus, so it's already being rewritten by different cultures way before Joyce gets hold of it. In terms of a modern man's adventures on one day in Dublin. This was a new kind of intertextuality. Chris has already talked about intertextuality in comics earlier this afternoon. So it's a new kind of intertextuality, which is reworking mythic archetypes in a contemporary context of mundane experience to create many subtle parallels which people might pick up on. Joyce never lectures his readers, but gently nudges them towards certain conclusions. He never spells out the connections and the parallels and the contrasts. He leaves you to kind of work it out. Joyce reimagined the Odyssey to democratize the notion of the heroic and to shift its field of action from history and the battlefield to our everyday thoughts and experiences. Each chapter corresponds to an episode where Odysseus overcomes hostile gods and monsters while striving to return home from the Trojan War, as recounted. Of course, the Trojan War itself is recounted in Homer's earlier epic, the Iliad. chose Odysseus rather than Achilles, the killing machine hero of the latter of Homer's earlier text, in order to challenge machismo and the politics of force writ large in the industrialised conflict that was laying waste much of Europe when he was writing the novel. The world had never seen murder on that scale before. Odysseus and Bloom defeat their adversaries, or they overcome their adversaries, if you like, by brains and wit, not rule and violence. Another influence, of course, behind Bloom is Chaplin's Tramp, the little modern everyman who gets out of scrapes through ingenious slapstick contortions. Hence, in the Cyclops chapter, from which Bloom's protest that I quoted above, that's not life, men and women, force hate history, and all that. Hence, in the Cyclops chapter, from which Bloom's protest comes, he confronts Joyce's equivalent of Homer's one-eyed, man-devouring giant. The Cyclops is transformed into a kind of narrow-minded nationalist in the Dublin boozer. Joyce was a kind of Irish nationalist himself, but one who had a very different vision of Ireland's future, which I'll come to in a moment. The still that I'm showing from the 1967 film adaptation of the novel actually depicts the Cyclops figure of the citizen wearing an eye patch, just to kind of make the notion of monoptic vision, tunnel vision, that clearer. By making his own comic hero a scapegoated Jew, Joyce dreamt up a future independent Ireland, more like the one we know now, with room for diversity, tolerance, and open borders. Bloom is as Jewish as anyone else. He just happens to have as Irish as anyone else. He just happens to have a different ancestry. Joyce was prophetic in placing anti-Semitism at his novel's narrative heart, as mid-20th century history would confirm so appalling. And I think the fact that anti-Semitism is there and it's kind of tested, it's part of this kind of test of the modernity of nationalism and the idea of a future nation state, I think is really significant. So Ulysses was also Joyce's way of writing himself beyond the literary cul-de-sac of his earlier semi-autobiographical fiction, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So its rather alienated and self-absorbed protagonist, Stephen Dedalus, becomes Joyce's version of Odysseus' son, Telemachus, whose quest to realise his future potential as an artist is given a new kind of maturity and social value by finding a spiritual father in the form of Blue. So that's the encounter with Hunter, I think, just set off all kinds of things for Joyce. And he even demotes his own role in the novel, his own sort of quasi-autobiographical avatar, plays second fiddle to this figure of the Irish, of the Jewish Irishman. And it's Bloom who's Odysseus rather than, the artist as hero. Regarded by many authorities as subversive and obscene, Ulysses could not be openly imported or offered for sale in an island dominated by the Catholic Church, for fear of it being banned, as was, of course, the case in several other countries. However, it embodied the mental and physical complexity of being human much more holistically than any fiction before, and not just through sexual fragments. Each chapter is dominated by a different organ or bodily function, from the eye to digestion to the genitals, with another change of style to match. Joyce builds the everyday world, what's become known as Bloomsday, with such completeness that he boasted if Dublin were ever destroyed in an earthquake, it could be recreated from his text. The text itself contained, as it were, a blueprint of the city. Similarly, Nora Barnacle may never have read the book, but her influence and sayings allowed the author to empathise with a female point of view more authentically than predecessors such as Homer, or many of Joyce's male literary contemporaries. So Nora Barnacle is integral to the way that Ulysses works, and in a sense she's a kind of co-author of of the text, despite never having read it. Keeping Bloom/Joyce grounded in everyday reality, when they mansplain or get too up themselves. Oh, rocks, tell us in plain words, is one of Morley's sayings that gets into the text. Nora's fictional avatar, Bloom's wife Wally, who corresponds to Odysseus's long-suffering wife Penelope, challenges the hypocrisy of sexual double standards, which is so embedded in the literary tradition. During the course of his wandering, Odysseus enjoys various extramarital dalliances with nymphs, witches, and princesses. On the other hand, fully in charge of her own desire, Molly stakes an equal claim to satisfaction through her adulterous liaison, which is the kind of, around which Bloomsday kind of pivots, and which Bloom knows is going to happen. And the relationship between them illustrates the complexities and compromises that are inherent in any kind of marriage of long standing. Joyce also literally gives Molly the last word in the novel's long interior monologue. So Molly isn't patiently waiting at home for the return of her sort of Odysseus figure. She also, as it were, gets the last word in the text itself. And the final chapter, of course, is famously known as Penelope and kind of closes the text. It's the longest interior monologue in the novel. It's about 100 pages long and is punctuated only into 8 separate sentences. It's Molly's stream of consciousness, made externalized for us. So go on, give the mythic everyday of Ulysses another go. In our precarious times, with the politics of force on the rise once more, human equality under threat around the world, and power dynamics between genders still requiring some urgent address, Ulysses has never been more topical. It's 100 years old, and yet it speaks to our times in some extraordinary ways. I can't pretend it's an easy read, but it does reward the effort many times over. But as I say, I'm lucky it's my job. Okay, so I'll shut up.
Thanks, Matthew. Well, Graham said that he's a historian, so he has to tell stories. So I'm an archivist, so obviously I have to speak about the past, which is what I'm going to do just now. I'd like to whisk you back to the late 19th century Dundee. So here we are. And Dundee was, as you probably know, just emerging from a period of rapid industrialisation, population expansion, technological change. And it really had a status as a global city at that time, being as it was a major manufacturer of textiles that had made some people very wealthy, but lots of people had really poor working conditions and atrocious living conditions. And this actually is from an 1870 album that we have in the archives, depicting a kind of before and after during sort of city improvements. This was a before, and a lot of the main thoroughfares in the city were straightened and some new buildings were built, but really a lot of people still lived in really, really poor conditions. Having said that, the late part of the 19th century was also a time of expansion in arts and education, fueled partly by this increase of wealth, both the middle and upper classes, but also by a late Victorian understanding of the importance of culture and education, even for those ordinary working class people. So you get the Brannis, what was then the Albert Institute, having opened in 1867, and of course University College Dundee, being founded in 1881. You probably all know, because I recognise most of you, that the college was founded in the same place the Tower Building is now, in 4 houses that were later knocked together to make a whole building, and then later still in the 1950s and 60s knocked down to make the tower. So this was UCD. And I'm going to talk today about 3 women who were all born at the end of the 19th century, so when UCD was starting, all from families connected to the textile industry. And all 3 women appear in our exhibition in the Lamb Gallery, Tales of the Unexpected that Matthew mentioned at the beginning. It's an exhibition that we invited artists and designers and creative writers to come and look at the museum and archive collections and to create responses to that. So I'm going to start with Elizabeth MacDonald. That's her maiden name. She became Bryson when she married. I'll just pause for you to admire her hair, which is pretty marvellous. She was born in, I don't know how she gets her hair actually. Anyway, she was born in 1880. She was the fourth child of 9 children, 7 of whom actually had an education at university, despite the family being pretty poor. Elizabeth herself studied at St Andrews and then gained her medical degree from the University College Dundee. Medicine, I did this for you. Her autobiography, Look Back and Wonder, it's a fascinating glimpse of life in Dundee at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Her mother was originally a teacher who, as you did then, gave it up to have her family, and her father was a clerk to various companies, including Duke companies. The family fell into poverty when her father lost his job during a jute slump, and they all had to move into a 2-roomed house. And she vividly depicts what it was like living in these conditions. So she says, for example, there's a big double bed in the corner of the kitchen. This is for father and mother. And there's an old clothes basket where the baby sleeps nearby. Then there's a very clever thing that no one would notice unless it was pointed out. Over in the corner by the window, this is still the kitchen, over in the corner by the window, there's a thing that looks like a big trunk covered with an old red tablecloth. Well, it isn't a trunk, it's a folding bed, and at night when it's unfolded, both the boys sleep in it. And the other room, the second room, where the piano is, Mary sleeps with little Jen, and now that my cold is better, I sleep on a couch there. The piano gets a mention, and it's allowed to take up part of the room because it was important. Elizabeth's mother giving piano lessons would slowly improve the circumstances of the family. And I found the determination of the family to make the most of what they had, and where possible to improve things, really inspiring. And this other section from her biography kind of depicts this, and she talks about happy days. She says, though we were poor, we were not without grandeur. We had a piano that was never silent, and we had an encyclopedia that was seldom on the shelf. And we had a silver tea service that was in daily use. It was the only one we had. So Elizabeth's father, who was a writer in his spare time, also contributed his bit by publishing this volume in 1890, a collection of stories and poems which sold pretty well. And he was actually recognised in Dundee as a poet of considerable ability. The family actually had several literary connections. Elizabeth herself knew William McGonagall, and she writes in her autobiography about how she and her friends followed him around and laughed at him. So I'm kind of hoping they laughed in a nice way, not in a kind of nasty way. So when she was 10, Elizabeth won a bursary to Harris Academy. And this was a real indication of her talent, as the bursary was only given to one person, a boy or a girl, every 3 years. She won it, and she went on to win it again 3 years later. And it's at this point that her interest in medicine begins, and along with a kind of conviction that opportunities should be open to men and women equally. She recalls how part of the award of her bursary, she was taken to see the town clerk, who, as adults often do when they can't think of what to say to children, asked what she wanted to be when she grew up. And when she said a doctor, he replied, a doctor? Nonsense. Not a nice little girl like you. Surely not a doctor. Needless to say, that's exactly what she did. But at that point, women were not allowed to study medicine until they were 19 years old. So first she just studied for an MA in English at St Andrews. She gained a first before moving on to medicine, which she completed at the New Medical School in Dundee. And she became a really active, she played a really active role in the then University College Dundee, taking classes with all those notable people like Patrick Ellis and Darcy Thompson and so on. And she was instrumental in raising funds for the new student union, which is here. You'll probably recognise that. That's Perth Road, going to Perth Road. That was where the student union was. And she actually, so she wrote to the local newspapers about the new student union, saying, for example, that the men are to occupy the first floor, entering by the front door of the building, having sole right to the handsome entrance hall, and their rooms included billiard rooms, smoking and reading and writing rooms. The women had to go around the back. A special staircase was constructed so they didn't bump into each other when they went up there. And she says the furnishing of the union was being carried out in a tasteful and dignified, if not sumptuous fashion, as a kind of compensation for the fact that the billiard room belongs exclusively to the men. The women are to enjoy the luxury of having curtains and cushions in their rooms. So I'm not sure which was better, really. So she went on to become vice president of the union and graduated with distinction in 1905. And she was described by the then principal as one of the most brilliant and capable students I've ever known. She went on to be one of the first students to be awarded a Carnegie Research Scholarship and spent a further 2 years in Dundee. And this is from the college magazine, which was a student magazine in 1906. And she's actually privileged to be given the first kind of article about her. She was the first woman to be given this. And basically it just talks about how wonderful she was and all of the things that I said of the active role that she played in the college. But also in this edition of the college, they're complaining, I'm starting at the bottom there. They talk about how wonderful UCD is in terms of men and women who study together. All the more remarkable is that when the student days are over, our medical women should for the first time be made to feel the disadvantage of sex, and that in the very institution which has treated women students with such magnanimous fairness. So basically, women couldn't go on to get a job in the hospital, to be resident in the hospital. So Elizabeth MacDonald didn't like this. She emigrated to New Zealand, where she developed expertise in all sorts of things like medical inspection. She was a women's physician. She had expertise in a psychological approach to genealogy. And we have her handwritten journal written after she went to New Zealand. She says that she's got no regrets about leaving, but she says in her autobiography that when people say she was a pioneering medical woman, she responds that it was because she had the good fortune to attend a medical school that never knew what it was not to have women in lectures in hospitals. And that was University College Dundee. That's my time. So the next person I'd like to talk about is Ruth Young. Here she is. She looks such a smiley lady. I'd love to have met her. So Ruth was born 4 years after Elizabeth in 1884 to a slightly wealthier family. Her father was a flax merchant. When Elizabeth was undertaking her Carnegie Research Scholarship, Ruth was also studying for BSc, and then, like Elizabeth, went on to graduate in medicine in 1909 from University College Dundee. Just like Elizabeth, she recognised her prospects for working in Dundee were limited, so she did postgraduate study abroad and then went to India to take a post as a lecturer at the Women's Christian Medical College. And she spent a year as actually a professor of surgery at the Lady Hardinge Medical College in Delhi. She became an expert in maternity and child welfare and travelled the world providing training, building networks and researching and practice in this area. And we've got journals that detail her travel and experiences in countries like India, China and America. And here you can see an extract from her China diary. She was later principal of Lady Hardinge Medical College and director of the maternity and child welfare. Well, I could go on. She did lots. She got an MBE and she got a CPE. And she was a pioneering woman who provided inspiration for several of the people who contributed to our exhibition. One, Loretta Mulholland, has produced a written piece in response to her. And this is Loretta says, when browsing the archive collections in the basement of the tower, I was drawn to the thin pages of a rebound journal. The typed fonts, accompanied by a scattering of black and white photos, instantly attracted my attention. Dr. Young was an essential part of Rockefeller Foundation's planned funding to improve healthcare for women and children, but her personal account reveals a love of people, films, literature and travel, a canny sense of humour and a spiritual humility. And Sharon Maitland was drawn to Ruth Young's travels in America, particularly because Ruth talks about issues in healthcare during the Depression, and particularly conversations surrounding illegal abortion and issues with birth control are detailed in the diaries. So finally, I want to finish with somebody that you probably recognise. You probably wouldn't have recognised Elizabeth and Ruth, but this is Mary Brooksbank, and you probably know a lot about her, so I'm not going to say very much. Her Jute Mill song lyrics appear on the outside of the Scottish Parliament. Although she was the only one of the three women I'm talking about not to have a university education, she was just as determined as Elizabeth and Ruth to make her mark. Although she was born in Aberdeen, she moved to Dundee as a child. She left school at a young age to work in the factories and spent her life standing up for people's rights, particularly women's rights. So when Elizabeth was sailing off to New Zealand and Ruth was settling in India, Mary was here fighting for workers' rights, taking part in the jute strikes. And she was a lifelong member of the Communist Party, and later in life used her songs and autobiography to raise awareness of the lives and struggles of ordinary people. Look out later on this year for a publication by the Acton Historical Society to mark the 125th anniversary of her birth. We have her manuscript notes of her songs in the archives, and it's really fascinating to see kind of corrections that she made in some of the draft songs. And she was also the inspiration for Suzanne Scott, who you might know as Whimsical Lush, who created this amazing piece that's in the exhibition, inspired by her writing, particularly the Jute Mills song. And if you're interested in finding out more, just Google Suzanne Scott Whimsical Lush, and she has a blog where she talks about this piece. So at the end of her blog, Suzanne Scott finishes by saying, "Here's to inspirational women." So that's how I'll finish my talk. Thank you.